You're listening to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, created to help you succeed in your Security Plus certification journey. Learn more at baremetalcyber.com, where additional prepcasts, books, and training materials await. Let's get started. Vendor and supply chain risk refers to vulnerabilities that are introduced not by an organization's own systems, but by the third parties and upstream suppliers it relies upon. Today's businesses are deeply interconnected, outsourcing payroll, relying on cloud providers, or sourcing hardware components from manufacturers around the world. Each relationship expands the organization's attack surface. A compromised vendor account or a tampered hardware shipment can cascade into direct risk for the organization itself. Understanding vendor and supply chain risk means recognizing that security does not end at your company's boundary but must extend outward to include partners and suppliers. Supplier risks come in several categories, each with distinct impacts. Technology risk arises when vendors provide software or hardware that contains vulnerabilities, as seen in recent high-profile supply chain attacks. Operational risk stems from service providers who may fail to deliver on time or go offline themselves, disrupting your own processes. Legal risk emerges when vendors mishandle data, leading to regulatory violations for your company. Geopolitical risk highlights the possibility that foreign policy changes, trade restrictions, or political instability in a vendor's country could compromise reliability. Categorizing risks ensures organizations view supplier exposure holistically, beyond just technical vulnerabilities. One emerging tool for managing supply chain risk is the Software Bill of Materials, or SBOM. An SBOM is essentially an ingredient list for software, detailing all components, libraries, and dependencies used in a product. SBOMs are critical because many vulnerabilities are transitive. You may not use a vulnerable library directly, but it is embedded within a vendor's software. Without an SBOM, organizations may be blind to these risks. For example, the Log4j vulnerability spread quickly because it was hidden deep inside software packages. SBOMs provide visibility, allowing organizations to identify and remediate risks more proactively. Vendor tiering is a practical method to prioritize oversight and controls. Not all vendors are equally critical, so organizations classify them into categories such as critical, high, medium, or low. A payroll provider with sensitive employee data may be labeled critical, while a vendor providing catering services may be considered low. Criteria for tiering include access level, data sensitivity, and dependency importance. Tiering ensures resources are directed toward vendors with the most potential impact. Without it, security teams may waste time auditing low-risk suppliers while missing risks from critical partners. Onboarding checks form the foundation of vendor due diligence. Before engaging a supplier, organizations often use security questionnaires to assess practices, evidence reviews to verify compliance, and baseline attestations to confirm alignment with standards such as ISO 27001 or SOC 2. These checks establish a vendor's maturity and help identify potential red flags. For instance, if a cloud provider cannot demonstrate routine vulnerability management, it signals higher inherent risk. Onboarding reviews may feel administrative, but they set expectations up front and reduce the likelihood of surprises later in the vendor relationship. Contracts are a powerful tool for managing vendor risk because they define enforceable obligations. Security clauses may include breach notification timelines, giving your organization early warning when a vendor is compromised. Audit rights allow your team to validate compliance, while SLAs, service-level agreements, formalize performance expectations like uptime or patch timelines. Indemnity provisions allocate responsibility for damages, ensuring vendors bear some of the cost if their negligence causes harm. By embedding these clauses into contracts, organizations create legal leverage that transforms security requirements from verbal promises into binding commitments. Continuous monitoring of vendors ensures that risk management does not stop after onboarding. Vendors should provide ongoing vulnerability disclosures, periodic security attestations, and even telemetry sharing where appropriate. For example, A managed service provider might share logs that demonstrate patching cadence or intrusion detection activity. Third-party monitoring services can also scan the Internet for signs of vendor compromise. Continuous monitoring recognizes that vendor risk is dynamic. Today's trustworthy partner could become tomorrow's liability if their security posture weakens. This ongoing diligence provides assurance that risks remain controlled throughout the vendor lifecycle. Supply chain attacks often exploit subtle, overlooked vectors. Firmware tampering at the factory level, compromised build systems that inject malicious code, and counterfeit hardware components are all examples. These risks can bypass traditional security defenses because they enter through trusted channels. For example, malicious updates signed by a compromised vendor can spread across thousands of customers before detection. Recognizing these vectors highlights why vendor and supply chain risk requires more than contracts and questionnaires. It requires deep technical scrutiny and layered defenses. Organizations must assume suppliers can be attacked and prepare accordingly. Dependency mapping is essential to identify single points of failure or areas of concentration risk. A business might discover that several critical systems all depend on the same cloud provider or telecom carrier. If that provider experiences an outage, multiple systems fail simultaneously. Mapping dependencies reveals these hidden choke points, allowing organizations to develop alternatives or diversification strategies. For example, a company may add a secondary internet provider or backup vendor to reduce concentration risk. Dependency mapping transforms a vague sense of exposure into a clear map of where resilience must be strengthened. Vendor risk management cannot be left solely to the security team. It requires cross-functional involvement. Procurement ensures vendors are contractually bound to meet requirements. Legal verifies compliance with regulations and crafts protective clauses. Business owners provide input on operational dependencies. Security evaluates technical safeguards. Together, these groups make balanced decisions, weighing cost, performance, and risk. For example, procurement may find a cheaper vendor, but security and legal may advise against them if risks outweigh savings. Cross-functional collaboration ensures vendor risk management aligns with both business and security objectives. When issues arise, clear remediation expectations must be in place. Vendors should be required to address critical findings within agreed timelines, often formalized through SLAs. If remediation is not feasible, compensating controls, such as additional monitoring, may be applied. Escalation paths ensure unresolved issues are quickly raised to senior management or governance bodies. For instance, a vendor failing to patch a critical vulnerability may trigger executive review or suspension of services. Defining remediation expectations ahead of time ensures accountability and prevents disputes when problems inevitably arise. A practical exercise can help learners put this into action. Select one critical supplier, such as a cloud hosting provider. Request their most recent security attestations, like a SOC 2 report or ISO 27001 certification, to confirm ongoing compliance. If relevant, ask for a software bill of materials for the systems they deliver to identify transitive vulnerabilities. Finally, map the top 3 shared dependencies. Perhaps reliance on a single data center region, a specific network provider, or shared administrative access. This exercise shows how to move from abstract vendor trust to concrete, evidence-based validation of security posture. By the end of Part 1, learners should see vendor and supply chain risk as unavoidable but manageable. Through tiering, onboarding checks, contractual protections, and dependency mapping, organizations can take control of third-party risks rather than leaving them to chance. Vendors may expand attack surfaces, but structured diligence, monitoring, and remediation expectations create resilience. With this foundation in place, Part 2 will explore advanced practices like continuous vendor scorecards, segmentation, contingency planning, and coordinated incident response across complex supply chains. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Continuous vendor scorecards are one way to keep a living picture of supplier performance and security posture. These scorecards can track metrics such as patch cadence, history of past incidents, and the currency of required attestations. For example, a vendor whose SOC 2 certification has expired or who has repeatedly missed patch deadlines will quickly stand out. Scorecards allow organizations to move beyond one-time onboarding checks and instead maintain an ongoing measure of how vendors are performing against expectations. Over time, trends on the scorecard also help identify which partners are improving and which are introducing increasing risk. Segmentation and least privilege access are critical measures when integrating vendors into your systems. Even trusted partners should be given only the minimum access required to perform their work. Network segmentation ensures vendor connections are confined to specific zones, reducing the blast radius if their accounts are compromised. For example, a managed IT vendor may need access to one set of servers, but should never have unrestricted access to customer databases. Least privilege keeps breaches contained, making it harder for an attacker who compromises a vendor to move laterally across your environment. Organizations also need monitoring specifically tailored to vendor-source threats. This includes tracking supply chain CVE's vulnerabilities tied to widely used third-party components and subscribing to vendor compromise alerts. For example, if a critical vendor is reported to have suffered a breach, your team should have a way to be notified immediately and assess exposure. Continuous monitoring platforms can flag when vendor-related risks appear in public data sources. By keeping a watchful eye on supply chain indicators, organizations reduce the window between vendor compromise and local defensive action. Contractual right-to-audit clauses strengthen oversight by giving customers the ability to verify vendor controls. In practice, audits may be conducted remotely by reviewing documentation and logs, or on-site by inspecting facilities and interviewing staff. While full on-site audits may be costly, they provide assurance for critical vendors handling sensitive data. Remote attestations may suffice for lower-tier vendors. The key is that audit rights exist contractually, ensuring the customer has leverage if they need to confirm that vendors are actually following required practices rather than simply promising to do so. Onboarding and offboarding controls ensure vendor access is properly managed throughout the relationship lifecycle. When a vendor is first engaged, accounts and keys should be provisioned securely with clear ownership. Equally important is deprovisioning. When a contract ends or staff change roles, vendor accounts must be revoked promptly. Too often, offboarding is overlooked, leaving dormant accounts vulnerable to misuse. For example, a vendor's former employee may still have VPN credentials if access is not revoked. Strong onboarding and offboarding processes ensure vendor relationships do not leave behind unnecessary security holes. Escalation and contingency planning prepares organizations for vendor failure. Even the best-managed vendor may one day suffer a major incident, insolvency, or geopolitical disruption. Contingency plans should identify alternate suppliers, outline steps to transfer services, and define contract exit strategies. For example, an organization heavily reliant on a single data center provider may negotiate a secondary provider as a backup. These contingency measures reduce dependency risk and allow business continuity even if a critical vendor becomes unavailable. Planning for failure ensures resilience in an unpredictable global supply chain. Cross-vendor incident response coordination is increasingly important as supply chain incidents often affect multiple parties. An attack on a widely used software vendor can impact dozens of customers simultaneously. Coordinated communication ensures that information is shared efficiently. Timelines are aligned, and customers are kept informed. For example, a vendor compromise might trigger joint calls with affected customers to share remediation steps. Coordination avoids duplicated effort and inconsistent messaging, which can otherwise amplify confusion during crises. Preparedness for multi-party incidents ensures faster, more effective responses. Metrics provide a structured way to evaluate supply chain security maturity. Useful measures include the percentage of critical vendors with current attestations, average time to patch for vendor-induced CVEs, and the rate of incidents traced back to third parties. These metrics highlight where improvements are needed and allow leadership to monitor overall third-party risk exposure. For example, if only half of critical vendors provide current certifications, governance bodies can press procurement to enforce stricter requirements. Metrics transform vendor risk management from subjective judgment into evidence-based oversight that can guide resources and accountability. Insurance is another layer of supply chain risk management. Policies may cover losses caused by vendor failures, but terms vary widely. Some insurers exclude certain supply chain risks, while others may require proof of strong vendor governance before providing coverage. Insurance can help allocate costs when vendor negligence causes damage, but it cannot replace proactive risk management. Organizations must review coverage carefully to understand how supply chain exposures are treated and ensure policies align with their actual vendor dependencies. Properly structured insurance provides financial resilience alongside operational safeguards. Procurement gating ensures that vendors cannot be onboarded until they meet minimum security criteria. This gate may require vendors to provide attestations, pass questionnaires, or remediate findings before contracts are signed. For example, a procurement team might refuse to finalize a deal until a vendor demonstrates compliance with data protection standards. By blocking high-risk vendors early, organizations avoid inheriting risks that are difficult or impossible to mitigate later. Procurement gating shifts the burden of proof onto vendors, making security a prerequisite for doing business. Lifecycle reviews keep vendor risk management fresh over time. Vendors should be reassessed periodically, with their classification updated as dependencies or criticality change. Termination triggers should be defined, such as repeated audit failures or major breaches without timely remediation. For instance, a vendor initially classified as medium may become critical after being integrated into a core business process, requiring stronger controls. Lifecycle reviews prevent vendor risk management from becoming stale, ensuring oversight evolves alongside the business. Ultimately, supply chain security requires continuous diligence rather than one-time assessments. Organizations must request SBOMs and attestations to illuminate hidden risks, enforce least privilege to minimize exposure, monitor vendor performance with scorecards and metrics, and plan fallbacks for inevitable disruptions. No organization can eliminate supply chain risk entirely, but through structured governance and proactive measures, they can make it transparent, accountable, and resilient. When supply chain risk is managed this way, vendors become strategic partners rather than blind spots, and the organization can maintain confidence even in a complex, interconnected ecosystem. Thanks for tuning in to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, your trusted source for cybersecurity news and insights. Remember to subscribe at baremetalcyber.com so you never miss an update. And visit cyberauthor.me for best-selling cybersecurity books that equip you with expert knowledge. Until next time, stay secure and stay vigilant.